I'm joined today by two luminaries of the trade world, I'll call them. William Bain, my colleague, Head of Trade Policy at the BCC, and Amanda Brooks, who's a lead negotiator with the Department for Business and Trade. I'll turn to them in a moment to talk about their subject and also to say a bit about themselves. But in the meantime, welcome to our session today. We will have plenty of opportunity to answer any questions that you may have, and I would ask you to use the Q&A function, which should be at the top of your screen, to raise those questions, and we will try and get to as many of them as we can. So turning to you, Amanda, maybe introduce yourself, say a bit about yourself and your background and so on, and then we'll go to William and then to the subject in hand. So Amanda.
Thanks, Liam. Morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining this session this morning to talk to us a little bit more about the deals and the opportunities that we are negotiating. As Liam's just said, my name's Amanda Brooks. I am the Director General in the newly formed Department of Business and Trade, and I'm the Director General for Trade Negotiations. That means I cover all the negotiations that are currently live with the rest of the world. I don't cover negotiations with Europe, but I also have had responsibility in my time in the previous department, that was the Department for International Trade, covering most of the trade agenda, having worked on everything from remedies, disputes, export controls, and indeed on our work in the WTO, G7 and G20. So I think I'm telling you I'm a bit of a trade nerd.
Well, less of the nerd and more of the expert, I think, in that sense, Amanda. But the thing is that your knowledge of those trade deals, and indeed what today's about, is what their intent was. How were they intended to grow our economy and grow our international trade for businesses in the UK? So what was the intent? What is it we still need to do? And also, of course, we'll come on to what our businesses are telling us. Turning to you, William, you have an interesting history in terms of trade too, so share that, please.
Indeed, thank you, Liam. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I mean, trade is the thread that's run through my last 25 years in terms of my journey, starting off as an EU law academic at two UK universities. Then as I call my sabbatical period, spending 5.5 years at Westminster as an MP. And one of the highlights was being on the BIS Select Committee, which then was scrutinising the TTIP negotiations. So we did a lot of work on trade in that time. And then for the last 6 years, I worked firstly for a trade association dealing with Brexit and trade issues, and then delighted just to be rounding off my second year and counting with the BCC, working with our SMEs, chambers across the country, trying to focus on getting the most out of new trade deals for SMEs and new exporters, and pleased at the progress that we're making.
That's really useful, and also a nice segue, isn't it, into the work, indeed to draw on the work that you do, William, in terms of representing SMEs and businesses and the negotiation and consultation with Amanda and her teams during the negotiation phase, and the importance of doing that. So anyway, this is really about the trade deals that we've got, and you'll recall, it's interesting you mentioning TTIP, William. We all remember TTIP, what happened to that, but that predated, of course, or was mixed in with the Brexit vote, and subsequently the negotiation to roll over many of the trade deals that already existed as part of the single market, and to add to those in the work that's been done in Australia, New Zealand and other locations, and continues to be to carry on in respect to CPTPP and those us acceding to that partnership. So turning to you, Amanda, let's hear from you in terms of where you feel we're at the moment. What more can we do to really ensure that businesses are able to take advantage of the trade deals that we have in place?
Thanks, Liam. And actually, I thought what I'd do just step back for a little minute, because we kind of often plunge rightly into kind of what do we do about them. But I think it's always worth kind of responding to the challenge that you set at the very beginning, kind of reflecting about why are we doing them at all? Why do they matter? And, you know, in the simplest form I can manage is, for me, the work that we do to negotiate trade agreements is about making it easier for businesses to trade and invest. That's it at its most simple. And why does that matter? Well, because making it easier, obviously, is a good thing in itself. But also, trade deals are there to provide clarity and certainty and to build confidence for businesses in terms of the rules in which they're going to operate, and which, as I say, gives confidence for trading and investment. And confidence really matters. And we all know that. We've seen, she says really carefully as a civil servant, some moments where we've had a bit less confidence over the last year, and some moments where we've had more confidence. And, you know, we can see the real difference that makes. But also, it's not just about providing that clarity and certainty now, it's also about providing frameworks for cooperation as trade and investment relationships grow, and indeed the shape of the economy changes, both in the UK and indeed in our negotiating partners. So one of the things that we're always trying to do in the trade deals is kind of create mechanisms which enables us to kind of keep them updated, both in terms of what we learn as we go, because sometimes, sadly, what we intend and what happens is not quite the same thing, but also, as I say, as the economy evolves. So kind of first things first, you know, kind of they matter because they matter for you, the business community, in terms of trying to make your job, which is growing your business, delivering high quality, prosperous jobs for the people of this country all across the country, is a little bit easier. And anything and everything we can do to help with that, I know matters at all times, but certainly in the times of uncertainty that we're facing. So where do we stand today as the UK? As Liam just referred to, at the point at which we left the European Union, or heading towards leaving the European Union, the team was working incredibly hard to ensure that you, the business community, had continuity in terms of the trade deals that then existed, that we were part of as part of the EU. They sometimes get referred to as cut and paste deals. Oh my Lord, I wish they had been. They really weren't. They were hard work. But at the end of the day, we managed to create new agreements, continuity agreements, for 36 of the 39 agreements that were in place. And there's a bonus point for anybody who can name the 3 that weren't in place then and are still not in place today. I'll see if anybody takes me up on that later. So where does that leave us today? We have agreements, including those that we have reached with Australia and New Zealand, that now cover 70 countries around the world. That covers about 60% of our trade as the UK. And when we begin to look into the detail, because the detail really matters, how are those being used, and to the extent to which they're being used? Well, from my perspective, we're doing reasonably well. We're seeing about 75% of goods that are imported into the UK from using these trade deals from the rest of the world, not the EU, are already utilising the preferential terms that the trade deals provide. That's fantastic. It's not good enough though, is it? Because that means 25% of the opportunity, and this is just on goods because that's the easiest to track, is not being taken. And our current assessment is there's a number of different reasons why that is. Firstly, it's very simple, it's awareness. Do businesses know that the deals exist, that they can use them, that it might make a difference to them? Some of it is definitely about choice. So we sometimes hear from businesses that although the preferences exist, that they can be a bit too hard to use, it's a bit too complicated. Is it worth the effort of understanding the deal for the return that you get? And I understand that's a reasonable judgment. And occasionally, and Liam, William and I were having a conversation about this only last week, we hear that businesses are kind of not using them on a risk-based assessment, where they're concerned that that they may actually not be entitled to those preferences for some reason, and therefore they'd rather not use them. in case they then subsequently get penalised for having used them incorrectly. And so that's something that's quite challenging. But what makes the difference for us as the negotiating team, what makes the difference for us is knowing what makes the difference for you. We need real specificity of information. Doesn't matter whether this is about a deal that we're negotiating today, and I'll come on and name check you through all of those in a minute, just so you know what's coming, but also about those that exist today. If you're finding that they don't work, or they're a bit too hard to understand, or a bit too complicated, that's the kind of information that we really value, because at the end of the day, we are doing this for you. We have a lot of fun doing these. We do enjoy it, we promise, but we are doing it for you, not just because we think it's fun. So we really thrive on the volume of information that you can provide us with as individual businesses about what matters most and what will make the biggest difference. There's lots of ways that we can do. You can feed that into us. At the start of every negotiation, or in fact, before we start any negotiation, we always run a call for input, asking you to tell us what would be the changes that would make a difference. And that forms absolutely the critical heart of our negotiating strategy in terms of what we're trying to deliver. But I spend a reasonable amount of time through any negotiation talking to William and colleagues from trade organisations and business representative organisations, or indeed anybody who will talk to us at all, about how the negotiations are going and what more information it would be helpful for us to have. So there is literally throughout the negotiation an ongoing chance to continue to influence and provide us with information. At the point at which a deal is signed, sadly, it's not the point where it's operable to you yet. We need to bring the agreements into the force. But once we've brought them into force, we also continue to assess whether they're working the way that we intended, whether there's new opportunities, and we can assess and address those on an ongoing basis. So, for instance, in the continuity agreements that I referred to earlier, it became apparent pretty quickly, because businesses told us, that there were challenges on rules of origin, both with Switzerland and with Israel in terms of the existing agreements. Telling us really mattered. It meant that we could go back, we could converse with both Switzerland and Israel and agree changes that would make a difference. And in both of those cases, that has happened. And I haven't since heard that anybody's having a problem, but maybe today somebody will tell me that they are, which is fine. Please do. I'd rather know than not know. So I just want to emphasise how important it is that you tell us what matters. And at any point, don't ever feel that you've missed the moment. You never have. There's always another one. So please tell us. I said, and then I'm going to stop and hand over to William. I would just kind of name check what's still being negotiated, or not still being negotiated, is being negotiated and coming up, because I also know that for some of you, you will be operating in these markets already. You will be keen to understand what the opportunities might arise from those. For others of you, you may not know, and therefore actually you might want to think about how you're growing your contacts, your networks in those countries, perhaps ready to take advantage of these deals when they come into force. So firstly, Australia and New Zealand, I hope you've read about them in the newspaper. Please believe me when I say there was a lot more to them than just about agricultural trade. They are fantastic agreements that cover the full breadth of goods, but also have extensive commitments in relation to services trade, to movement of people between the countries, to our investment climate, to digital trade, which is where the UK has been particularly pushing globally to create new rules that will provide that confidence and certainty that I talked about at the beginning. Those two agreements, yes, they've been signed. They're not yet into force. There was another debate in Parliament yesterday, which means we're getting ever closer. And I'm really hoping, she said, with her toes and fingers crossed, that those will come into force in the next few months. And therefore you will finally, as she said, be able to use them. But also, even this week, we've new agreements announced this week that we have negotiated with Ukraine. We have an existing trade agreement with Ukraine, but the Ukrainians came to us late last year and said, we've seen what the UK is doing on digital trade, and we think this is really going to matter to our future. and we want to negotiate an agreement with you on digital trade. I mean, how impressive is this? A country at war, dealing with so many things, this has prioritised this, and they really have. So the Secretary of State signed that agreement earlier this week. We'll be working hard now to bring that into force quite quickly. Typically, we are able to bring digital trade agreements into force much more quickly than full trade agreements. And given that already over the majority of our goods trade, even our goods trade with Ukraine is digitally delivered, we know that this will make a difference to our trade and investment relationship with Ukraine, just as the agreement with the Singaporeans on digital trade has made a difference. So what's coming up? Liam managed to nail the glorious CPTPP, an agreement with 11 countries that we're seeking to accede to. Negotiations on that are at an exciting stage, she said carefully. William's heard me say this more than once, though, and are heading, I hope, towards a successful conclusion. And hopefully we will be able to share more about that in the coming weeks. This week, I have a team who are negotiating in India. This is a really big and complicated trade agreement, reflecting the fact that India's economy is highly protected in comparison to the UK's, and indeed that their experience and precedent in negotiating trade agreements is very different to ours. They don't tend to reach agreements that are as broad and as wide-ranging and as ambitious as the UK has done, but you'll be unsurprised to know our ambition knows no bounds, and we're pushing them very hard. It's driving them mad. I also have a team in the UK this week from Canada, running the next round of negotiations with Canada, and other negotiations underway with Mexico, with the Gulf Cooperation Council. That will be a really exciting agreement if we can pull that off. Again, a group of 6 countries with some fascinating opportunities for the UK, and whose experience and existing pattern of trade agreements is relatively small. And then we are updating our agreements with Israel, particularly to focus on services and digital and investment, where the existing agreement is quite, I think I'll say thin. I think it's a bit worse than thin, to be honest, but because it's a much more traditional goods only type agreement. So we're reaching much further, we hope, with Israel. And then finally, last but by no means least, we are continuing to negotiate with Greenland, which is part of a complex setup given its relationship with Denmark and its relationship with the European Union. So all of those are ongoing. One I've not mentioned, the US. As many of you will know, under the Trump administration, we made great progress on negotiating a trade deal. Indeed, we'd concluded the majority of text in the majority of chapters. However, under the Biden administration, they have not prioritised trade agreements with anybody in the way that they are such a focal point of the UK's trade agenda. We've had some interesting trade dialogues with them. William, I think you were there with me in Scotland at various points there on some of these last year. I know that the Secretary of State and Ambassador Tai spoke last week about revitalising those trade dialogues between the UK and the US. So I'm very excited and hopeful that we'll see some more progress with the US, but it will not be at this stage in the context of a full FTA. The US administration remains, sadly, given it's our largest trading partner beyond the EU, it's sadly not in that space. 2 more to mention, and then I really will stop, I promise. We are also will imminently announce new negotiations with Switzerland and South Korea. We have existing agreements with both. The Swiss agreements are quite dated. They aren't great on services and investment, for example, and certainly nothing on digital. So there's a real opportunity for us to expand and grow those agreements. We have run the call for input from businesses already to prepare for the launch of those negotiations. But as I've said all along, it's never too late to tell us what we need to know. I'll stop there because I've spoken for long.
Thank you, Amanda. That was a real long list of things that have been going on in the last 4 or 5 years. I wouldn't say that we ever thought what's that Amanda Brooks up to these days? We didn't, because I know you and your teams have been very busy, and it's easy to refer to those TCA, to those European rollover agreements as something, as you say, that was easy. But we should remember that every negotiating party was looking for an opportunity to improve on the EU deal with the UK. And of course, we were on our side hoping to make some improvements too, and particularly if we think of the data arrangements and the digital trade arrangements with Japan and others. It's for us to judge in the long term, but the aim of this is about stimulating businesses to make much more use of trade agreements, either through claiming those preferences that they're absolutely entitled to, or indeed in considering, as you said at the outset, Amanda, those markets as places to grow our business and to grow our exporting. Now, we know that from data that's only 1 in 10 businesses in the UK are trading internationally. Our big aim at the British Chambers of Commerce, and one of our key pillars of activity, is about growing, helping businesses to understand how to grow from no market to one market, or one market to more than one. William, you talk to our businesses regularly at fora that we create in our chambers, and also at things like the trade dialogues with the US, where civic society and governments come together from both countries, and many other opportunities. So tell us about what you're hearing. What are our businesses saying to us, and where do you think the direction of travel is, particularly if you can cover the TCA? I know that's outside of Amanda's remit, so we've got a number of asks in that. So let's tell our audience about that.
Great, thank you, Liam, and good morning again, everyone. As we do a lot of events, both virtual and in person, around the country, I think the sense that I have from companies is their eagerness and willingness to export. We have some brilliant export stories going on. People, exporting tea to China, high quality services into the United States. And I think all of the evidence is clear that firms which are able to do that are more innovative, they're more open to investment, they've higher profits, higher productivity. So exporting is a win-win. And it's our aim as a BCC to get more companies exporting, and to get those companies that already export to increase their export volumes and to look at new markets. Now, some years ago, when I was at university and first encountering trade law, really at that time, it was all about China had just joined the World Trade Organization. We were taught the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. And really, at that time, you didn't do very much around trade agreements, because everybody thought the future was going to be global. Well, we did see in the early 2000s, kind of the Doha round at the WTO kind of run into the ground, and countries beginning to look more to what kind of arrangements they could do bilaterally with other countries. And that gave birth really to this sort of huge rise in trade agreements we've seen across the world in the last couple of decades. And I think the key thing to demystify what a trade agreement is it's basically a series of commitments that countries make to generally lower tariffs to goods from the other markets that they're making the agreement with. So we see lower customs duties. We see chapters to make customs processes smoother. We see removal of regulatory barriers to trade, which can often be the most difficult in terms of getting into a new market, dealing with the technical regulations and some of the certification requirements that some countries have had. So trade agreements are great for easing and removing a lot of these, and in a sense, that the key to opening the door to traders to have better trading terms and to see new opportunities ahead of them. And as Amanda said, I think the sort of key thing around Brexit was to ensure that traders didn't lose the terms that they'd had before. So that's why there was so much focus around continuity trade agreements. But of course, now we're entering a stage where the UK is doing its own trade agreements, with partners with whom perhaps it hasn't had a trade agreement before. And I think there is some anticipation about the benefits that the Australia and New Zealand deals will present in terms of export opportunities. I spoke recently in Doncaster, and there were firms there saying that they were counting down the days to having lower tariffs on their exports of paint products to Australia. So that is, I think, the beneficial purpose that they have. But as a British Chambers of Commerce, we've been very clear that it's SMEs that really should be at the sort of heart of the benefits that come from these trade agreements. So we have a big job as an organisation to explain how to use some of these benefits, how to export, how to use these new trade preferences, and also to get the rates of companies which could be benefiting and could be exporting up. And we work in partnership with the UK government and the devolved governments to secure those aims. Before we get on to the TCA, where kind of are we in terms of the sort of future markets, the future areas where trade can grow for UK companies? Well, I think it is noted that in the last few years, the UK has done very well on two particular areas. One around digital trade. So if you think about our services exports, 85% of those are transmitted digitally. So having good digital agreements, such as we now have with Ukraine and with Singapore, are critical to being able to support our services exporters. But they also promote e-commerce in terms of goods as well, and they facilitate the transfer of data, which is fundamental to making international trade efficient. So I think the UK has done very well at getting these digital trade chapters into its new agreements. And I think the other trading blocs in the world are looking at it and saying, well, similar things can be done there too. So I think that's a really important area. I think green trade provisions in trade agreements are critical too. We all know that there are big commitments the world has made collectively at the last couple of COPs. Access to wind turbines and other green technologies and green services as well alongside these is quite critical for the world to meet these targets. And the UK has a great opportunity to be able to expand its green exports. And the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, said last autumn that if we get things right, we can be expanding our green exports by 5% by the end of the decade. So I think UK trade policy is getting it right in expanding those green trade possibilities. There's a big shift going on to Indo-Pacific region. It's not just the UK that's doing that. The EU's looking at it as well. The US, of course, sees itself as part of that region. Well over half of global growth comes from that region. 90% of the expansion in the global middle class is going to come in that region by the end of this decade. So that is an area where the UK and our exporters should really be looking at focusing on, given the consumer spending growth that's going on there. And that's where CPTPP creates opportunities. We will get new preferential trade terms with Malaysia, with whom we don't have a bilateral agreement at the moment, and Brunei as well. And then also, I think as Amanda set out the present pipeline, which is really ambitious, but we're always looking ahead to the second half of the decade and where things will develop in the future. And I think there are possibilities to look at potential trade deals with Thailand and Indonesia, So to, in a sense, build on CPTPP and get right into those other ASEAN countries. And I think that would create opportunities for our exporters as well. The other big challenge that's come up in obviously the last 13 months is the collective response to the war in Ukraine and the impact it's had on supply chains, where we source our raw materials from. And of course, that's a big challenge as well. And I welcome the fact that in the integrated review last week, the UK government, acted on a BCC recommendation and is now going to have a supply chain and imports strategy. I think that's really important for our manufacturers. And that is another element of where I think trade policy and trade agreements in the future may look at and develop, as we try and diversify our supply chains, where we get our metals or minerals from. That's, I think, going to be another facet in the second half of the decade in terms of where I think the UK will need to look to, perhaps upgrade some of its current trade agreements or perhaps make some more. I think we would be quite supportive of expanding trade opportunities with other major blocs around the world, but we accept how difficult that is in some cases. Brazil is a big market. I accept the great difficulties there would be to look at a free trade agreement with Brazil, although of course the EU has one that it's trying to implement with Brazil, the other Mercosur countries. But we should be looking, I think, to expand our opportunities for exporters in that market and in South America, Latin America, more generally. So I think there are some key areas where the progress that's been made in the last couple of years can be built upon, and we can get new opportunities for our exporters. I come back to Liam's essential point, which is our largest trading market, the EU. And I think the advantage of the way that the Chambers network operates and the input we have from companies, the research which you help us with, is that we've put together, I think, a pretty much industry-leading report on the current shape of UK-EU trade, the issues which importers and exporters face on a daily basis, and some pragmatic proposals in terms of where that relationship might develop as we see the Windsor framework being implemented, the relationship getting better between the EU and UK, and nearing that review of the TCA at the end of 2025 and into 2026. So I think what the research sort of indicates to us are that sort of key sectors where SMEs do find some issues are around how the rules of origin within the TCA operate, how you can combine materials from outside and still have them as qualifying goods. We also have international chambers in membership, and I know that a lot in the Balkans region, for example, have problems with the UK not being in the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention anymore. And so one of the proposals we've put forward is to seek, it's obviously a multilateral agreement, but to seek greater flexibility through perhaps seeking membership of that PEM convention. And that would deal with some of the issues that some of our exporters face. Around VAT, obviously, it's a different system. You're not in a common VAT area anymore. So import VAT is a fact of life. What we at the BCC are trying to do is to make that easier for companies. So the requirement to have a fiscal representative, which companies using the EU's one-stop shop to account for VAT. Our Norwegian friends don't have that, and it's our sense that we would like the UK government and the European Commission to negotiate something to ensure that UK firms should not have to do that, and that would reduce some of that red tape in terms of selling goods into the single market. We've come up with a range of other proposals, for example, with the retention of CE marking, allowing CE marked goods in GB to circulate alongside UKCA, essentially letting the market decide, and so ensuring that costs don't go up for manufacturers. And I think there are some key areas where we can have, we hope, mutual recognition of professional qualifications. We'd like to see a bit more Mode 4 access, where people can provide services in person in the EU. So maybe get some flexibility on those business travel rules. So there are 24 recommendations in all in the document. I hope you'll be able to have scope to perhaps have a quick look through it. And certainly I know when we speak to ministers, when we speak across Parliament, I think there is acceptance that it is a well put together body of work and genuinely reflective of the current position for exporters and importers, and the way in which the relationship could develop within the framework of the TCA, within the art of what is possible within that as conditions improve. So I think I'll conclude with the point, Liam, that is that there is no lack of ambition for UK companies to seize these opportunities that this new world, dangerous at times though it is, represents. And I think the key thing is to ensure that SMEs' views are at the heart of the deals which are being done, and that we probably focus as much on implementing and ensuring that all SMEs can benefit every bit as much as those negotiations which interest so many of us in the trading world. Thanks.
Liam, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I mean, schoolboy error really, but you both alight in your penultimate points, I think, at the same kind of place, which is that when a trade deal is signed, it's not the end. It's actually the beginning of a relationship in trading with a country, that typically there are review points baked into the arrangement such that there's a recognition that it mightn't be perfect right now, so let's make sure that there are points. And in the TCA, there are specific review points. There is a group of people that come together from both sides that talk to each other, and in respect of the TCA, have been able to get to the Windsor Agreement as a way of improving. Some people might say that the vote in Parliament yesterday on this shows the majority in favour by a long shot in progressing and moving forward with our trading arrangements with the European Union, which is a good thing. And also, as you said, Amanda, in those rest of world agreements, those review points, that continuing dialogue ensures that you can, where it makes pragmatic sense to both sides, can improve the deal. So I now want to turn to some of the questions that we have. We have a couple of very specific and some might say technical questions, but I think we can answer them. And it's an interesting one, Amanda, on origin, and relates to women's clothing, women's exercise clothing particularly. And actually, Katie gives us the commodity code on there and says, I currently pay 12% import to the UK, and 12% on over $1,000 when exported from the UK, and says, would a preferential origin statement be appropriate? Would I be able to use that HS code and get tariff-free trade? I guess the answer is kind of nuanced and really comes down to where were the clothes manufactured, don't they?
So I'm going to say very carefully, I can't give a specific answer on all 17,000 commodity codes. So please don't test me, because it'll all go terribly wrong very quickly.
I think it's the principle here, isn't it? Isn't it the principle?
So the first thing, so also in Casey's question, there is something very specific of, can you see them, the list of the codes somewhere? Yes, we publish them. They are published on the government website, so you can Google and pull it up and then find the code. And I'm sorry, that sounds quite laborious. We do also have a check the tariff code or check the tariff rate tool, but at the moment that will be loaded with the current tariff rates rather than the rates that will come into force when the agreement is in place. But Liam, you absolutely have nailed it. I'm afraid, as always, the devil is in the detail on this, which is you will need to look at the rules of origin. You will need to look at whether you are able to meet that and demonstrate that you can meet the origin requirements to understand whether you do would qualify for the tool. But the information is in the public domain already. It will be in the public domain in a bit easier a way once the agreement has actually come into force. So bear with us.
Only, as you say, only when it's in force does the tariff table change. But if you Google tariff lookup HMRC, which is what my search term always is when I need to bookmark it and haven't yet, that's the place you'll find it. It's a step-by-step guide that takes you through. But the fundamental, Katie, is where were the women's exercise clothing manufactured? What's the country of origin in effect? Now, if you're importing women's exercise clothing that was manufactured in Australia into the UK, in principle, if the origin is Australia, then once the agreement is fully in place, then you should be able to claim origin using an origin statement on invoice, or you could ask for an EUR1, an equivalent of a preferential certificate of origin from your supplier in Australia. Likewise, in the UK, if you're exporting from the UK and the clothing was manufactured in the UK or substantially processed in the UK, let's say you brought in cloth, you then manufactured that cloth into clothing and exported it to Australia, then in principle, if sufficient transformation has taken place and you've changed the commodity code from cloth to clothing, then you would be able to also claim tariff-free trade into Australia. And again, you could either use an origin statement on invoice, and the wording for that is within you'll find within the tariff, or you will again, you can get a preferential certificate of origin from HMRC or from your local chamber, which does tend to carry a bit of weight because it's been subject to some scrutiny. So you've got two options there on that. Also, if I can turn to Bob, who's talking about starting to sell to Australia in about 2 months. Amanda, 2 months? Can we do it in 2 months? Can we get tariff-free trade in 2 months? I don't know. It depends whether Bob, it's fully baked in by then.
Yeah, Bob, I wish I could give you kind of guarantees, but I can't, because I'm afraid it's in the lap of the parliamentary gods. So I would have my fingers and toes crossed for 2 months as to whether you can do it, and keep a really close eye on developments. It's possible, but I don't think it's certain, I think is the honest answer.
Yeah, and the other thing I would raise with Bob is, you know, in currently, are the goods that you're selling to Australia subject to a tariff? The tariff may be zero. So there may be nothing to see here. And then the other thing I'd probably want to talk to you about is selling ex works. And at what point, and how do you know if you sell ex works that the goods leave the UK border and that you don't become subject to VAT for having sold the goods but not knowing where they've gone? So ex works sounds great and sounds brilliant from a seller's point of view, but it isn't always from a compliance and risk point of view. So I would look at that as well, and I could reassure you the following: talk to your local chamber, who will be able to give you really good advice on what would be best and appropriate for you in exporting to Australia, mitigating risk for yourself in terms of VAT in the UK, but also you know, leaning into, if you like, the transfer of title of those goods at an appropriate point in the journey between your factory gate and your buyer in Australia. And again, the principle here is You're selling goods to Australia, but did you manufacture them, and what is the origin of the goods? Can I turn to William? You talked about the TCA and what our asks are on the TCA. What are the kind of key things that are stopping businesses in the UK utilising either the TCA or any other agreement? What does the evidence say about barriers to trade? And what do you think needs to happen to really stimulate businesses to do more overseas trade?
Well, I think in terms of what we get back in research, and we do regular surveys of SMEs who are membership of chambers up and down the country, and the kind of points which come back very regularly are for non-agri-food exporters, it's sort of VAT and rules of origin, which are the two major bugbears, and they'd like to see some improvements in how these can operate. If you're an agri-food exporter, then obviously the requirements for export health certificates on consignments going to the EU is a major issue. So it depends on the nature of the goods. On the services side, I would say we do have a lot of people saying, well, look, we would like to be able to send our employee to be able to go to the office in Paris for a bit more than 90 days out of every 180. We'd like to do a bit more in person. We still have some doubts about which activities are permissible and which aren't. We also have no mutual recognition agreement on professional qualifications in the TCA, and frequently that's mentioned to us as a real problem. So there are some practical ways in which hopefully as things improve and we get into 2026, that we'll see some mutual benefit on both sides, because we're lucky to be able to speak with EU ambassadors recently on the report, and they were saying that they have much the same issues on business travel and mobility issues as UK companies have trying to post staff or send staff into the EU. So I think we should have confidence that as we get into 2026, we can reach some common ground and make some improvements within the framework of the TCA.
Yeah, and it's where we're at. So we need to make the most of where we are, but also be working towards where we need to be. And I guess that's just the nature of these things. But turning to there's a big goal here, Amanda, in terms of exports. I think it's £1 trillion of exports by 2030. The Minister at the Mansion House speech end of last year said we were well on our way, 800 million of exports. But last week we had a kind of numbers coming out saying exports had fallen. Where are we at with that? I mean, what is it from a DBT point of view you think needs to happen to stimulate that and grow that? It can't all come from just price rises, can it?
Oh God, no. Can I just say something on utilisation? I said I don't do TCA. I don't. However, because I look at preference utilisation rates, generally, it is worth reflecting that notwithstanding everything that William has said, and you will have seen me nodding because I've heard the business community saying this to me, and William has said it to me in different contexts as well, in terms of the recognition of all those things that have been mentioned. It is worth saying that, whereas before, earlier on, I said 75% of goods imported into the UK from the rest of the world is using the preference utilisation. That figure is over 90% this is imports from the EU. So again, obviously that's not 100, but it's interesting to see where it is. But I'm not saying that to underplay in any shape the issues that have been mentioned, which I'm familiar.
That's all contributing to input costs being lower than they would be for subsequent exports. It's about competitiveness, isn't it? So not everything we import is consumed. Some of it is assembled, changed, amended, and re-exported. Yeah,
correct. And it exactly goes to the point that both you and William have made on supply chain resilience. Actually, as we have seen, whether you go back to the tsunami in Japan many years ago, where we suddenly discovered that For example, some of our automotive manufacturers had fourth and fifth tier suppliers who were operating in that region of Japan who did not know and who did not have a contingency plan because they didn't know that they might need one in a way. This point on contingency and what the COVID epidemic has shown us has been, how we need to absolutely ensure that our supply chain resilience is really understood and factored in. And I think it is a way where trade agreements can help, because they help diversify sources of supply in terms of competitiveness by giving you both bigger export market potential, but also hopefully bigger import kind of resilience as well, in terms of that cost competitiveness from the reduction of the barriers that you might need to meet, or the tariffs that you might need to pay. So it is absolutely critical. Going back to what you actually asked me though, because I managed to focus on something else completely, which is always worthwhile, but I wasn't avoiding the question. Look, you're right. We have a very, very big target for what we need to meet. And export figures at the moment are, I think we'll politely call them, quite volatile. And there's lots of reasons for that, obviously. Yeah. The Russia-Ukraine war has had a significant impact on volatility. We are still, dealing with the consequences of the COVID pandemic, obviously the reopening of major markets, particularly China, but also some of the other Asian markets which have remained, should we say, more closed than others. As those are opening up, that is going to change the trading environment again. And I think we see this volatility in a way that is quite challenging. I think the key really is not to focus on month figures, is to look at where the trend is. And at the moment, if you look at the trend from UK exports, it is rising, although not in a beautifully straight line, or indeed as fast as any of us would like to see. But, this gets us back to what other colleagues across DBT do to support businesses to export, working, of course, very closely with the chambers of commerce across the country, which is helping businesses understand the opportunities in other countries, helping them make those links. If you're working with our overseas network, to try and find the right opportunity, the right partner for you in a particular market, then all of this is about channeling kind of the enthusiasm that exists. But Liam, you said at the beginning, the biggest challenge, 1 in 10 of our businesses is exporting. I mean, crikey. We all need to share our experiences and share the opportunities and raise awareness and support people as they face the challenges, because when you do anything for the first time, it is a little bit scary. And there will be issues that you encounter that you won't have. So that's why Export Academy matters. It's why international trade advisors, it's why the chambers matter, because we are there to try and make it as easy as possible for businesses to thrive.
Absolutely. And actually, we're just going to, if it's okay with you, we'll finish off with one of those practical issues that Bob is facing with his Class 1 medical device that's sold over the counter. So that sounds to me like a kind of medical device that you might use to clean your earwax or something like that. I have no idea, but what it is. But I'm thinking in those terms, something that's intrusive as a medical device sold over the counter. He's got CE marking, he's got a rep in Europe. And sometimes, and I don't know that this is the case, Bob, so forgive me if it's not, but sometimes people's belief about what they need to do can be based on what their agent or someone in another market tells them, rather than what the trade agreement or the regulatory agreements say. It's some kind of drop. He's just put the link into the chat there. But the point is that it's a drop device for eye drops and so on. So the point here is that he's been told that he needs to have, the product has to specifically have the language, is my understanding, for the country in which it's been sold, and that a multiple language leaflet isn't enough. Now, I don't know that we here today can answer that question, but I do think that it points towards the support that you've talked to, Amanda, which is get in touch with DBT and the export support service there, or get in touch with the local chamber that can help you to drill down on the specifics on your eye drop applicator, and what regulations would apply there. And William, you've done a lot of work on this kind of regulation packaging, the UKCA marketing and so on. So look, there is resources, Bob. Be assured of this, and everyone else on the call. Amanda Brooks is DG of DBT, William Bain is Head of Policy, me in the Chamber of Commerce, and my colleagues. We see it as a key mission for our UK PLC and our economy that we drive the growth in export. So when we come across barriers, believe me, we want to help you to get over them, to get round them, to get past them, and to be able to trade more. So please get in touch with us directly. Heidi, who's on the call in the background, will take details, Bob, of your email address, and we'll certainly share those, and we'll help you navigate around that problem so you can sell much more of your product to the rest of the world. It remains for me to say thank you, Amanda, for giving us your time today. I know that you'd much rather be negotiating a deal with the US than sitting here. And thank you to you, William, for your insights, and to anyone else on the call that needs some help and advice to get over those barriers. Please pick up with us directly, and we'll do our utmost to make sure that you're supported. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us, and good day. Bye-bye.